SwageLock is committed to your business and to understanding your priorities. Their people aren't on your payroll, but they can be on your site, connecting you to experts around the world to help keep your plant's fluid systems safe and cost-effective to operate. Also, you can spend less time worrying about downtime and more time driving your business forward. Find out how SwageLock can help at swagelock.com/alongside you. SwageLock, put their team alongside yours. And now to the episode. Welcome in to another new AMP podcast. I'm your host, Ben Dubose, and I'm the news editor with the AMP Publications team. In that capacity, I create content for both Materials Performance Magazine, or MP, as well as for Coatings Pro Magazine, and today's episode is part of our MP interview series. For today's show, we're talking with Mike Augenbaugh of SwageLock Company. Mike is the Associate Target Market Manager for SwageLock, where he is focused on the oil, gas, chemical, and refining markets. Prior to taking his current role in early 2023, Mike worked for 3 SwageLock sales and service centers dating back to 2006 in a number of different roles. So on today's sponsored podcast, we're going to be talking about identifying the differences between pitting corrosion and crevice corrosion. But before we get to the meat and potatoes of all that, Mike, I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit more about your current role and your company. Where do you fit now within SwageLock, and what is SwageLock's general niche within the marketplace?
Yeah, so thanks for having me, Ben. I really appreciate you having me come in and join your team today. So, yeah, SwageLock is a fluid system component company. So we traditionally are known for fittings and valves and mostly tubing connections as opposed to piping. So SwageLock has 3 major markets. We have the oil, gas, chem, and refining, which is what I work up through. And then we also have semiconductor and clean energy as well. And then kind of a mix of other markets that we label as general industrial.
Okay, so let's start at a very high level. Again, we're going to be talking about pitting and crevice corrosion today and some of the differences, distinguishing factors between those. But at a high level, what are the conditions that result in corrosion, and what makes certain environments more corrosive than others?
Yeah, well, I hate to break it to everyone, but everything corrodes over time, right? It's not something to get overly nervous about. But really, it's about the speed at which corrosion occurs and whether this degradation of material results in any downtime or safety issues. So the good news is this, though. We have a pretty extensive history of particular applications and environments that are known for corrosion, and we can apply best practices in these situations to reduce the effects or prevent corrosion altogether. So some of the main areas of corrosion, though, will deal with moisture, things like oxygen, electrolytes, which can create like electrical reactions, temperatures, acids and bases, mechanical stresses, dissimilar metal galvanic reactions. But to answer your question, though, outdoor environments, and particularly those submerged in salt water or salt spray conditions, can cause issues faster than others. And usually these environments become even more corrosive as you increase temperatures. So from my time dealing with oil and gas customers, it's not a well understood topic.
Yeah, and you all have a lot of business in that space. So I want to try and put some perspective on what it means for that industry. Just how common is it within oil and gas systems, and why is corrosion so problematic for oil and gas operators specifically?
Yeah, sure. So offshore environments are usually the most problematic. So you're dealing with 2 major issues here, namely internal and external corrosion, whereas downstream chem and refining usually only affects the inside of piping and tubing systems. So on the inside of these systems, you'll be dealing with things like high sulfur from crude, and this can be an issue with certain metals or just the general abrasive nature of that fluid within the piping or tubing system with high velocity. So really where we concentrate, though, is on the outside of the system. So you have an environment with high moisture because you're on a platform somewhere, and you have elevated temperatures, and the chloride formations rapidly corrode these systems. So this is such a common problem that, usually the metallurgies in these systems will usually be exotic alloys. So things like, 6-moly and 625 and duplex and hastelloy, and others that can resist crevice and pitting corrosion better than standard stainless steel.
And when we're talking about costs, just to put it in context, What are those? Just how significant is it?
It's significant, right? So there's a group called NACE, which is the National Association of Corrosion Engineers, and they estimate that annually this costs the industry around $1.3 billion. And I like to split these up into like three main cost centers, right? So you have material, you have labor, and safety. And all three of these situations can be elevated, or you can have one factor that consumes the majority of these costs. So in any case, right, replacement of the systems that have degraded can shut a facility down. So we're talking about the integrity of the system now, right? So one particular application that I remember I dealt with years was actually in a downstream application, right? That a customer was installing stainless steel components in an HF alkylation unit at a refinery. And for those of you that know a little bit about HF acid, it will eat through austenitic stainless steel such as 316 at a pretty unbelievable rate. So luckily, this material mix-up was identified prior to the unit being started up, so the customer was able to avoid the catastrophic failure. But regardless, replacement of materials, additional labor, these things all add up if the material is not selected appropriately.
Yeah, and for the benefit of our audience, I'll point out that NACE International is one of the two legacy associations, the other being SSPC, the Society for Protective Coatings, that merged in 2021 to form AMP, the Association for Materials Protection and Performance. And of course, that's led to our podcast and our conversation today. Mike, one last introductory question before we get into the nitty-gritty of pitting versus crevice corrosion. How does corrosion actually form? At a high level, what is the initiation of the process?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit of a molecule nerd. I went to school for biology and chemistry, and what you should know about metals is you kind of look at them from the outside and look really, really smooth and shiny. But on the very microscopic level, stainless steels are a mixture of different elements from the periodic table, right? So some of these elements provide rigidity, some provide ductility, some are resistant to chemical attack, and a few of these are things like carbon, nickel, molybdenum, chromium. And when these alloys are melted to create stainless steel, these elements are melted, the material isn't really perfect. And so under a microscope, it will kind of look like a rough topography of peaks and valleys. Whereas, 1 nanometer over here can have a high concentration of one element that's really resistant. And then the other element, a nanometer away, can't handle it all, right? So the entire surface of the material is not uniform in its corrosion protection. And this becomes an issue when that protective chromium oxide layer becomes depleted, right? So these corrosive environments will attack those weak points. They're going to seek them out and ultimately corrode the material. So some alloys will contain higher levels of corrosive resistant elements, and some will contain less. And really that's the main reason why corrosion will form.
Yeah, so if you go to your website, swagelok.com, that's SWAGELOK.com, and you click on the blog page, you all have a number of resources on your website, but on that blog page, you've got an article called Pitting Corrosion versus Crevice Corrosion. What's the difference? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Obviously, because this is a podcast format, we're going to go into a little more depth than the usual word count limitations would have on an article. So if you want to see some of it in text form or to have as a reference point, you can call up that article on the Swagelok blog page. But again, that's just going to be the foundation for our discussion today, where Mike will be able to elaborate at a little bit greater length. So let's start at the beginning when it comes to pitting and crevice corrosion and the differences between those, specifically for oil and gas operators. Can you explore that in a little more detail?
Sure. Well, I mean, the good news is that pitting and crevice corrosion are pretty easy to identify, and they behave completely different than the other. And let's just start off with pitting corrosion, right? So pitting corrosion is typically uniform across the surface of a metal, right? And it forms under seawater environments for the most part, especially when salt water evaporates and concentration of chloride deposits increase. And the way you can pick this out is you can see small indentation or pits everywhere on the surface of the metal, and this usually resembles the appearance of rust, right? So if it's uniform, it's going to basically color the entire thing that color. Crevice corrosion, on the other hand, is a little bit more difficult to find, as the name implies, because you will have localized corrosion or degradation of the material under things such as clamps, gaskets, or hidden under a drip point. But really, this crevice in the name just basically says, hey, this is somewhere where you can't readily see this, right? You have to kind of investigate it a little bit. And crevice corrosion is a little bit different. It's the result of some stagnant fluids that have found their ways into these trapped areas, and they can appear quite large and even create structural issues if not identified in time.
All right, so two-part question to try and add some color to this discussion. Is one form more common than the other, and is one form more destructive than the other?
So in offshore environments, if strictly speaking about potential damages and extended material replacement, it's definitely pitting corrosion. Because what happens is you have an environment that allows that seawater to basically coat everything in an area, right? So it's not affecting just those crevices. Mm-hmm. And it affects large areas of the tubing, piping, and components. And because it's not localized to specific areas, the external protection of these systems is usually the focus, whereas pitting corrosion will be dealt with by by crevice corrosion will usually be dealt with system layout and protection in common failure zones.
So to clarify, you're saying that pitting corrosion is both more common and more destructive?
Yeah, because it affects larger areas. I would say you have to qualify destructive as being, does it cost more, or is it more of a failure point, right? I would say both of them are probably equally a failure point, but that the pitting causes greater material damage.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so what are some of the warning signs to watch for? If an operator's listening, how can they tell if they've got pitting or crevice corrosion occurring in that system?
Right. Well, pitting corrosion usually starts out as uniform rust appearance on the external surfaces of the systems. And you can kind of take your glove, and I've done this in the past, where you can kind of wipe it away, right? It kind of comes off with your glove, and that's an indication of the early stages of pitting corrosion. But, don't let this fool you. This is a key indication that the environment is slowly eating away at the metal. And depending on the speed of the corrosion, this can actually sometimes be acceptable. But, in my opinion, this is the day to put a potential replacement on the schedule, right? So get that at least documented. Tell somebody what's going on and say, hey, we're starting to see increased corrosion rates. At the very least, look at the easy fixes to keep this from happening in the future. Mm. With crevice corrosion, one of the things you can do is random inspections of your piping and tubing systems. And you want to find areas that you would expect to see these crevices form. And really, we always talk about kind of the best ways is to remove tubing and piping supports. So those little block kits that go over top and hold the tubing in place, mm-hmm. you can take those off and look underneath. And if it appears like rust is starting to form where these clamps held the tubing, you definitely have a system design issue. And, you can get some help from improved layout, or there are some products and metallurgies to solve these traditional issues.
All right. So another two-part question for you. We're talking largely about offshore oil and gas environments here. So what are the most common alloys that you all come across, and which of those alloys are more susceptible to corrosion potentially relative to others?
Yeah, offshore environments, we're seeing more and more of this right now. A lot of packages get released where we're asked for exotic alloys when in the past maybe stainless would be acceptable. Mm. But in offshore environments, stainless steel tends to have issues over time, as well as carbon steel, and then other things like post-transitional metals. So these would be things such as zinc and aluminum. Mm-hmm. And, it's not just an offshore thing or an upstream application. Sometimes you'll see downstream applications will also have problems with stainless steel. Mm-hmm. And in particular, downstream refining operations with units such as desalters. On the alkylation units, you'll have sulfuric acid that has, high H2S or HF acid. These tubing systems can also experience pitting and crevice corrosion. And this is why many facilities will actually perform alloy upgrades in these applications to prevent things such as LOPC, which is loss of primary containment. In downstream, you'll see about 95 to 99% of these tubing systems utilizing standard stainless steel, mm-hmm. and the balance being some alloys, some exotic ones. But, offshore tends to be the opposite, right? Because the entire platform is affected by the environment, really the entire system that's exposed outdoors will end up being that exotic alloy. So one trend that we're following with downstream customers right now is updating the specifications to lower thresholds for exotic alloy standards and installations. So in the past, the customer may say, hey, everything is stainless steel. Now customers are saying that, for example, any installation over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, just to throw a number out there, may now be a Monel Alloy 400 or a C276 to reduce the effects of corrosion.
One that you hear a decent bit about, at least within the scope of the industry that I cover, is Type 316 stainless steel. Is that a good choice? Is that something that you see when it comes to corrosion prevention?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I don't mean to dog stainless steel. It's actually one of the better alloys to handle corrosion, right? If you went back to the 60s and 70s, a lot of things were carbon steel pipe, and stainless steel tends to do a very good job. You know, if you really go back far, in some cases, old copper tubing could handle corrosion very well. So seawater can actually do quite well with materials that have copper in them. But others, stainless is just better suited. So, however, I always like to discuss metallurgy with customers prior to just simply defaulting to stainless steel in all applications. Some offshore and onshore applications will use materials such as 6-moly and 2507 more than stainless, but then we'll use stainless in things like utility gases and liquids. So, as an example, stainless steel is great for steam, right? But if you have leaks under insulation, known as CUI or corrosion under insulation, and it's creating a hot and humid environment, stainless steel can exhibit premature failure zones and stress corrosion cracking. So here's the good news. Your facility most likely has a metallurgist or corrosion engineer who can help you if you're experiencing any of these issues.
Do you know the difference between pitting and crevice corrosion? Pitting corrosion occurs on tubing surfaces in hot, high chloride environments. Crevice corrosion forms in the tight spaces between tubing and supports, clamps, or adjacent runs. Both are a problem. Corrosion causes $1.3 billion per year in damage, but the right materials can reduce its impact. Start managing corrosion more effectively. Review the material selection guide at swagelok.com. That's Swagelok, your source for fluid system expertise. So when you go to the Swagelok blog page that we referenced earlier, beyond the themes that we've already discussed, another couple of variables that you go into greater detail on are the importance of understanding critical pitting temperature, also known as CPT, and critical crevice temperature, known as CCT. What are those for anyone unfamiliar, and how important is understanding those variables to being able to address these corrosion concerns?
Sure. So the one thing I really want to have you take away from our discussion today is that increased temperatures will almost always put corrosion rates into hyperdrive, right? If you go back to our old chemistry days, when you increase the heat, the molecules end up moving faster and exert greater pressures on things. And so that has a lot to do with it. So, just remember, some systems will be perfectly fine in ambient temperature environments, but as soon as you increase the temperature, the system will exhibit corrosion. So let's talk for a second about CPT and CCT. So critical pitting temperatures and critical crevice temperatures, known as CPT and CCT, are measured by exposing a particular alloy to the application it will be exposed to, or kind of in a laboratory replicating as close as possible. And then what they do is they simulate the effects of increasing temperatures, and they see exactly the point at which corrosion begins on the metal surface to form. They have different temperature thresholds. So as an example, one of the most common ways that you can put this in a laboratory environment is you make a solution of 10% ferric chloride. And for example, 316L tubing will show a CCT, so a crevice corrosion, of negative 14 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas critical pitting temperature will be 50 degrees. So that's a pretty big difference between the two. The trend of CCT being lower than CPT follows pretty much every alloy out there, right? So this is where enlisting the help of your site metallurgist or your corrosion engineer, or even some vendors have the knowledge that might be able to assist with you in finding the right alloy that balances cost and effectiveness.
We're winding down our conversation now with Mike Algenbaugh, Associate Target Market Manager with Swagelok. Mike, as far as high-level takeaways for our audience, let's look at this from a few perspectives. First, what are some ways to remediate corrosion if a user finds it in the system?
Yeah, well, you can't account for everything. So the first thing I'll tell you is that installation and materials are the best way to prevent it in the first place. But it's also the solution for corrosion you're witnessing. So wiping away rust deposits, I know this sounds weird, but wiping away rust deposits or using a wire brush to remove it are not doing anything to prevent the condition. In fact, what you're doing is you're just creating fresh zones for the new corrosion to occur. Preventative measures are your best friend. You should enlist the help of your vendors for some innovative ideas and system design, and this can prolong the life of your fluid system. So one great example in oil and gas and chemical companies is the proper encapping and sealing of PIT, or what's known as pre-insulated tubing. The insulation in PIT is meant to insulate that tubing, but it can also wick the moisture from leaking connections or environmental ingress, such as salt spray, and it's the perfect environment for corrosion. So this is just one simple fix for long-term improvements. But what I would say is just short training classes to operators to help them identify the potential for corrosion to occur and have them report that up to get it fixed.
So that's how you would remediate corrosion if it's found in the system. You mentioned design in that answer. What are the best ways that you can design a system that prevents that corrosion from occurring in the first place?
Yeah, in our world and most of the world that deals with this issue, metallurgy trumps everything. So look at the best possible alloy to prevent future maintenance issues, but within the budget you're working with. Now, we understand not everybody can install, tungsten tubing or things like that. That can be quite expensive. There's some great solutions that can minimize impacts of corrosion. And one of my favorite solutions is actually just going with jacketed tubing. And this could be standard stainless steel tubing. And what it has is it has a plastic jacket around the outside, and it actually is very resistant to the salt spray and prevents it from getting to the stainless steel tubing in the first place. So, this can also prevent galvanic issues if you have tubing touching other components. But I will give you a disclaimer. You really need to seal off everything, right? Moisture can still get underneath those jackets. And that's one way to seal it off properly. I have another one. The second is to take a look at installation practices. So I did mention this a little bit, but tubing and piping make contact with another alloy can create an anode and cathode situation, which is referred to as galvanic corrosion. And it's often misunderstood, and that this only occurs underwater. So the atmospheric side of the platform can also be the perfect environment for galvanic corrosion due to the high humidity and sea spray and the elevated temperatures you're going to see. So if you see zones of your system being localized, it may not be pitting or crevice corrosion, but it could be galvanic. So that's really the first step, is to identify what type of corrosion it is. And this can be solved with better system layout. The next opportunity is to investigate the tubing primarily, right? Tubing can come in various wall thicknesses, but that being said, tubing will still not have the same granular mass and thickness of machine fittings and valves, and it's more susceptible to corrosion. So one of the things you can do is use standard stainless steel fittings with exotic alloy tubing. And at Swagelok, we call these engineered combinations. So if you're trying to reduce the overall cost of the system, go after the tubing, not the fittings, right? Because the fittings are going to have a greater density and mass of that metal to protect you, right? So engineered combinations is using standard stainless steel fittings with our metallurgy, and it allows you to mix that with some exotic alloy tubing that could be a cost-conscious solution for your problem.
All right, and the last question I've got is about the education component, which you mentioned a couple of minutes ago in your response. But what tools and resources are out there to help users educate their system operators about corrosion? What are the things that they should turn to make sure that those system operators have the education that they need?
Yeah, great question. I used to love talking to operators because they were always at the front line of the issues, and it's no different at your facility. They're going to see things before you can see them, before they become bigger deals. So really your best course of action, empower your operators to identify and document corrosion areas in your system. So early warnings to planners and engineers, these are key towards preventing the larger system issues. So for example, you have an operator that might be walking past the same panel or enclosure every day and notice that corrosion is getting worse, whether it's on a structural component or a fluid component. And this is really the time to document, but maybe even schedule the replacement, maybe an investigation if you think this is bigger than just the area that you're visiting, right? So also, you want to enlist the help of your facility corrosion engineer. The metallurgist might be able to give you some good ideas on how to train operators on identification and system integrity. If that is something that you're not ready for, you can also reach out to firms that specialize in these applications, as well as vendors, right? Vendors may give you some new metals that are out there that might be able to help you out that maybe you didn't consider in the past. So, many times these vendors have services also that can really help you identify, that can help you also document as well. So they can come on and actually review your system and tell you some things that they would tackle first to assist your maintenance programs and preventive maintenance schedules.
Great insight there from Mike Augenbaugh, Associate Target Market Manager for Swagelok, focused on the oil, gas, chemical, and refining markets. Mike, I'm assuming that if a listener wants to get more resources from you all, the best place to get that is probably the website, swagelok.com. Anything else you'd like to throw out as far as plugs from your end?
Yeah, so the way in which we work at a Swagelok organization is we have sales and service centers. They're going to be your most immediate group to reach out to for some of those immediate needs that you have. So please reach out to your local sales and service center.
And then you can get the contact information there from the website.
Absolutely.
Sounds good. All right, and with that, we can bring this sponsored episode to a close. On behalf of AMP, I'm Ben Dubose, and if you want more resources from AMP, again, that's the Association for Materials Protection and Performance, or for Materials Performance Magazine, also known as MP, just visit amp.org, ampp.org, or materialsperformance.com. As always, thank you all for listening, and we'll be back soon with another new episode.